The sound wasn't thunder. Sheriff Thomas Granger knew thunder from 2 tours in Afghanistan, knew how it cracked like rifle fire across muddy trenches. This rumble came from beneath the Tennessee earth, a low vibration that made his German shepherd Kota pace the station porch with hackles raised and ears pinned back. October storms in Pine Hollow usually brought nothing worse than power outages and fallen branches, but this one carried something else, something that made seasoned lawmen check their weapons twice, and old dogs refused to come inside. When grey dawn broke over the hills, a wrinkled envelope lay beneath the station door like a confession waiting to be heard. No postmark, no return address, just 7 words scrawled in desperate handwriting that would shatter 20 years of small-town trust. The children still cry beneath her floor. Margaret Dawson's farm sat 3 miles outside town like a picture from a charity brochure, white columns gleaming against rolling, pastures, rocking chairs swaying empty in the morning breeze. For 2 decades, she'd been Pine Hollow's living saint, feeding the homeless every Easter, dressing as Mrs. Claus each Christmas, running an orphanage where lost children supposedly found loving families. The county had given her humanitarian awards, the state featured her in tourism campaigns, and visiting politicians always stopped by for photo opportunities with smiling children. But Kota's nose never lied, and as Sheriff Granger's patrol truck crunched up the gravel drive that morning, the dog's low growl cut through the October air like a blade finding bone. Evil, Granger had learned during the war, doesn't always announce itself with screams and explosions. Sometimes it wears pearls, serves warm biscuits, and builds dungeons beneath barns where innocence goes to die. The crowbar bit into the barn's wooden floor with a sound like breaking teeth. Sheriff Granger's flashlight beam pierced the darkness below, revealing stairs that descended into blackness so complete it seemed to swallow light itself. Kota's growl had changed from warning to mourning, as if the dog already sensed what horrors lay buried beneath Margaret Dawson's perfect facade. The trapdoor groaned open, exhaling air thick with rust, mold, and something far worse. Chains hung from stone walls like metal tears, their iron links stained with evidence that would haunt Pine Hollow forever. But this was only the beginning. As Granger's boots touched the dirt floor, his radio crackled with Deputy Boone's panicked voice cutting through static. "Sheriff, we got a problem. That freight train running Thursday nights. It's not on any official schedule. Margaret Dawson's house is cleaned out, kids are missing, and there's blood on the kitchen floor." The beam found words carved into stone by desperate fingers. "More below. Follow the whistle." In the distance, a train horn echoed across the hills, long and mournful, carrying secrets that would unravel a trafficking network spanning 5 states. Kota's ears pricked forward, body rigid as stone. The dog had found the scent, but this trail led deeper than anyone imagined, into tunnels connecting basements to rail yards, orphanages to operating rooms, innocent faces to wealthy monsters who bought children like livestock. What they discovered in this underground chamber wasn't the crime itself, but merely the loading dock for an operation so sophisticated it had operated under the cover of Christian charity for 3 decades. The real horror wasn't what lay behind that trapdoor. It was realizing that Margaret Dawson's farm was just one stop on a railroad to hell, and somewhere in the darkness, a freight train was carrying its next shipment of stolen childhood toward buyers who viewed innocence as a commodity to be purchased. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel K9 Loyal Souls, where we uncover true stories of animals' bravery you won't believe until you see it. Pine Hollow, Tennessee existed in that forgotten corner of America, where time moved like honey through summer heat and secrets grew roots deeper than century-old oaks. Population 3,847 according to the faded welcome sign, 2 traffic lights that blinked yellow after 9 p.m., 1 main street lined with pickup trucks and good intentions. This was a place where neighbors still brought casseroles when someone died, where church bells marked Sunday morning and Friday night football games drew entire counties together under stadium lights that cut through rural darkness like beacons of community spirit. Sheriff Thomas Granger had protected these 847 square miles for 15 years, dealing mostly with domestic disputes that ended with handshakes, drunk drivers who usually turned out to be somebody's cousin, and the occasional bonfire that brought half the county running with garden hoses and genuine concern. His German shepherd partner, Kota, had been by his side for 7 of those years, a retired military working dog whose nose could track a scent through hell itself and whose instincts had been honed by war zones where survival meant reading danger in the wind. Together, They'd found lost hunters wandering through autumn woods, missing teenagers who'd gotten more adventure than they bargained for, and enough hidden moonshine stills to float a battleship down the Cumberland River. But nothing in their combined experience, nothing from Granger's tours in Afghanistan or Kota's years, detecting IEDs in Kandahar, had prepared them for October 2023, when a simple anonymous letter would expose a trafficking network so sophisticated it operated under the cover of Christian charity for over 3 decades. Margaret Dawson's farm had been Pine Hollow's crown jewel, a sprawling antebellum plantation turned orphanage where broken children supposedly found new families and hope bloomed like wildflowers after spring rain. The FBI would later discover that this same farm served as the southeastern hub for an international operation that moved children like cargo on freight trains, selling them to wealthy predators who viewed innocence as a commodity to be purchased at auction. The investigation that began with Kota's restless pacing on a storm-swept October night would ultimately rescue 127 children from 11 states, expose corruption reaching into state government offices, and prove that sometimes the greatest evil hides behind the brightest smiles and most generous hearts. This is the story of how one dog's instinct shattered 20 years of lies, how a small-town sheriff refused to look away when darkness wore the mask of righteousness, and how the voices of forgotten children finally found someone who would listen to their cries echoing from beneath the floorboards of hell. The envelope appeared like a ghost's whisper, sliding beneath the station house door sometime between midnight and dawn, when Pine Hollow slept under a blanket of October clouds. Sheriff Granger found it when he arrived at 6:30 a.m., his boots crunching through leaves that had turned the color of dried blood scattered across the parking lot by overnight winds. The paper was cheap dollar store quality, the kind desperate people buy when they can't afford better. White envelope yellowed at the edges and soft from handling by nervous fingers that had trembled while writing words no one should ever have to write. No postmark meant hand delivery, requiring someone to risk everything by approaching the sheriff's station in darkness, and the lack of return address screamed desperation louder than any siren ever could. Inside, 7 words written in shaking cursive would launch the most horrific investigation in Pine Hollow's 150-year history. The children still cry beneath her floor. The handwriting belonged to someone whose hands trembled with either fear or rage, each letter carved deep enough to tear through to the envelope beneath, black ink pooling in certain places, as if the writer had paused to gather courage before continuing with this terrible confession. The paper smelled faintly of cigarettes and something else, something chemical, that reminded Granger of the field hospitals in Afghanistan, where hope went to die under harsh fluorescent lights, and the stench of antiseptic couldn't mask the smell of suffering. Kota sniffed the letter once and immediately began pacing, his nails clicking against linoleum in an agitated rhythm that made Granger's skin crawl with recognition born from years of reading his partner's instincts. The dog's reaction was visceral and primitive, as if he'd caught the scent of something that violated every natural law, something that triggered survival instincts bred into working dogs over generations of war and detection work. Margaret Dawson's name wasn't mentioned directly, but in a town of fewer than 4,000 people, where everyone knew everyone else's business and family history going back 3 generations, there was only one she who mattered when it came to children and their welfare. For 20 years, Margaret had been Pine Hollow's self-appointed guardian angel, taking in orphans and runaways from across the South, finding them loving homes throughout Tennessee, Kentucky, and Mississippi, with a success rate that made social workers from Atlanta drive up just to study her methods. The county had given her 3 humanitarian awards. The state had featured her in tourism, brochures showcasing Tennessee's compassionate spirit, and visiting politicians always made sure to stop by her farm for photo opportunities with smiling children who seemed genuinely grateful for her protection and care. Sheriff Granger's patrol truck crunched up the gravel drive of Dawson Farm at 9:15 a.m., Kota riding shotgun, with his ears already swiveling toward sounds only he could hear. The storm clouds hadn't finished their work, hanging low and heavy like wet concrete threatening to collapse on the Tennessee hills. Margaret Dawson's property sprawled across 200 acres of prime farmland, white colonial mansion gleaming despite the gray morning, wraparound porch decorated with hanging baskets of flowers that somehow still bloomed despite the October chill. Chickens pecked between hydrangea bushes, their soft clucking the only sound breaking the unnatural quiet that settled over the place like a burial shroud. Kota whined low in his throat, a sound Granger had learned to respect during their years together, the kind of warning that meant danger lurked beneath pretty surfaces. Margaret met them at the front gate wearing pearl earrings and a shawl that didn't match the mud caked on her boots, her smile tight as piano wire and twice as likely to snap under pressure. Her eyes were tighter still, calculating and cold despite the warmth she projected with practiced ease. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Sheriff?" she asked, voice sweet as pecan pie left too long in the sun, courtesy dripping from every syllable like honey from a broken jar. Granger tapped his hat brim, keeping his expression neutral despite Kota's increasingly agitated behavior. "Just a courtesy visit, ma'am. Storm's rolling in hard. Wanted to check on the children and make sure everyone's secure." Margaret hesitated for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for Granger to notice, but short enough to maintain plausible innocence, then stepped aside with a gesture that managed to be both welcoming and dismissive. "Of course, Sheriff. We always welcome the law in our home." The children were lined up in the dining room like soldiers awaiting inspection, about a dozen of them ranging from 6 to 16 years old. Clean faces, folded hands, plates full of warm biscuits that should have made the scene heartwarming, but instead felt rehearsed and hollow. They looked fine, too fine, like actors playing roles they'd memorized under threat of punishment. Not one child made eye contact with the sheriff, their gazes fixed on their plates with an intensity that spoke of fear rather than shyness. But Kota didn't care about the biscuits or the children's perfect posture. He walked slowly through the house, nose to the ground, ignoring every open door and every quiet smile. His body language spoke of tension coiled tight as a spring, ready to explode into action at the first sign of what he was tracking. When they reached the barn, Kota stopped dead, tail stiff as a board, and released a low growl that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his chest, somewhere primal and knowing. He paused at the threshold like something was calling to him from beneath the wooden floor, something that needed to be found before it was too late to save whoever was crying in the darkness below. "That's just storage," Margaret said quickly, her voice carrying the first crack in its perfect veneer as Kota's growling intensified near the barn's entrance. "Old tools, rusty nails, dangerous stuff. It's not suitable for children to play around, you understand." But her words came too fast, tumbling over each other like lies, trying to outrun the truth that was already surfacing in the October air, thick with the promise of rain and revelation. Sheriff Granger studied her face, noting how her left eye twitched when she spoke, how her hands clenched and unclenched at her sides, like she was fighting the urge to physically block their path into the barn, where secrets waited in the shadows. "I'd still like to take a look, ma'am," Granger said, his tone polite but carrying the authority of a badge that had seen too much human darkness to be easily fooled by charitable facades. Margaret forced another smile, this one so brittle it might shatter if touched by the slightest pressure. "Of course, Sheriff, please go right ahead and satisfy your curiosity." The barn was silent in a way that felt wrong. Even the storm seemed to hold its breath when they stepped inside, as if nature itself was waiting to see what secrets would spill from this place that looked so innocent from the outside but felt poisoned from within. Dust motes danced in shafts of grey light, filtering through gaps in the weathered boards, and the air smelled of hay, rust, and something else that made Granger's war-trained instincts scream warnings in his mind. Kota sniffed the floorboards methodically, circling a worn patch near the far wall where the wood looked different, newer somehow despite being stained to match the rest of the barn's aged interior. His nose worked overtime, processing scents that told stories no human could read, stories that made his hackles rise and his body vibrate with barely contained energy that spoke of urgent discovery. Sheriff Granger tapped the suspect boards with his boot, hearing the hollow sound that every experienced cop learns to recognize, the sound of empty space where solid ground should be, the sound of hidden chambers that shouldn't exist. "Do you use the basement for storage too?" he asked, watching Margaret's face carefully for tells that might reveal more than her carefully chosen words ever could. "We don't have a basement," Margaret said flatly, but her voice carried a note of desperation that contradicted her confident stance, and her eyes darted toward the barn door like she was calculating escape routes and measuring distances. Kota barked once, sharp and urgent like a gavel slamming down in a courtroom where justice was about to be served and truth was about to shatter 20 years of carefully constructed lies. Margaret flinched at the sound, her composure cracking just enough to reveal the fear beneath her charitable facade, the terror of someone whose darkest secrets were about to be dragged into the light of day, where they could no longer hide behind good deeds and community awards. That night, back at the station, Sheriff Granger couldn't sleep, despite the exhaustion that weighed on his bones like lead blankets. The anonymous letter lay spread across his desk under the harsh fluorescent light, those 7 words seeming to pulse with their own malevolent energy. The children still cry beneath her floor. He'd read them 100 times, studying every curve of the desperate handwriting, every ink blot that spoke of trembling hands and racing hearts. Kota paced in circles around the office, his nails clicking against the linoleum in an agitated rhythm that matched Granger's own restless thoughts. The dog's behavior had become increasingly erratic since their visit to Dawson Farm, as if he'd caught a scent that violated every natural instinct bred into his warrior bloodline. At 2:13 a.m., Kota suddenly stopped pacing and sat facing the window that looked out over Pine Hollow's sleeping streets. His ears pricked forward, body rigid as carved stone, and he released a low bark that seemed to echo with supernatural awareness. That's when Sheriff Granger heard it again, carried on the October wind that rattled the station's old windows. Not thunder, not the storm that continued to rage across the Tennessee hills, but something else entirely, a whimper, distant and wet and heartbreakingly real, like a child trying not to cry in the darkness where no one was supposed to hear. The sound lasted only seconds before the wind swallowed it again, but those seconds were enough to confirm what Granger's gut had been screaming since he'd found that letter. Margaret Dawson's farm was hiding something that would make seasoned investigators wake up screaming for years to come. The next morning brought a second anonymous message. This one slipped into Granger's coat pocket as he walked through Town Square, where everyone was buzzing about the upcoming Dawson Spring fundraiser. Posters were already plastered outside the feed store and the diner, Margaret's face beaming like she'd already been canonized for sainthood, the text proclaiming, "All proceeds go to feed and clothe our precious orphan children." The note was written on a different paper this time, torn from a school notebook with the faint blue lines still visible beneath desperate words scrawled in pencil. "They take us when the train whistles. Please listen to him. He knows." No signature, no identification, but the handwriting was smaller, younger, belonging to fingers that hadn't yet learned to hide their fear behind adult facades. Granger looked down at Kota, who had followed him into the diner without being asked and was now staring intently at the train schedule posted on the community bulletin board, beside advertisements for church socials and lost cats. The freight line that passed near the Dawson property ran every Thursday night at exactly 10:05 p.m., carrying cargo shipments from Nashville to Atlanta through the rural darkness where no one would think to look for human trafficking disguised as farm equipment. Granger didn't believe in coincidences, especially not when they involved train schedules and children who passed notes like prisoners planning an escape. This wasn't a sign from heaven or a supernatural message. This was a pattern, carefully planned and executed by people who understood that evil flourishes best when it wears the mask of respectability and hides behind charity fundraisers and community awards. That evening, Sheriff Granger returned to Dawson Farm with an official inspection order signed by County Judge Morrison, the kind of legal document that transforms courtesy visits into federal investigations. Margaret met him at the gate with the same practiced charm, but her smile had developed new cracks around the edges, like paint peeling from a house that looked perfect until you examined it closely. "I wasn't expecting visitors tonight, Sheriff," she said, her voice maintaining its honeyed sweetness, despite the tension that radiated from her like heat from a fever. "Not a visitor this time, ma'am," Granger replied, his tone carrying the weight of official authority that couldn't be dismissed with biscuits and southern hospitality. "This is official business." He handed her the folded inspection order, watching her eyes flicker as she read the judge's signature that gave him permission to search every inch of her property. Margaret's composure never wavered, but Granger caught the slight tremor in her hands as she folded the document with careful precision. "Very well, Sheriff. Let's get this unpleasantness over with so we can all return to our normal lives." She walked him through every room of the main house with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide, showing him bedrooms where children slept in neat rows, a kitchen that gleamed with cleanliness, and what she claimed was a cellar beneath the main house. This basement, which had mysteriously materialized since his earlier visit, when she'd claimed no such space existed, contained nothing but dust, broken furniture, and the musty smell of abandonment. But when they returned to the barn, Kota's reaction was immediate and visceral. The dog bolted toward the same floorboard he'd identified earlier, barking 3 times in sharp succession like an alarm clock announcing the arrival of Judgment Day. Granger had come prepared this time, pulling a crowbar from behind a beam where he'd hidden it during his previous visit. The metal tool felt heavy in his hands, weighted with the promise of truth that was about to surface from whatever lay beneath Margaret Dawson's carefully constructed facade. He wedged the crowbar under the old plank, applying pressure until the wood groaned in protest. It gave way with a reluctant creak, like the barn itself didn't want him to know what secrets it had been keeping for decades. Beneath the false floor was a latch, a rusted iron ring hidden under a thin layer of straw and accumulated time. The metal was old, corroded by years of dampness and the kind of neglect that comes from burying evidence too deep to surface accidentally. Granger looked at Margaret, whose face had finally abandoned all pretense of innocence. She no longer smiled, no longer maintained the charitable facade that had fooled an entire community for 20 years. Her eyes were cold and calculating, the eyes of a predator who had been discovered but wasn't ready to surrender without a fight. Kota growled low in his throat, a sound that spoke not of warning, but of mourning, as if he already knew what horrors would be revealed when that rusted ring was pulled and the trapdoor opened to expose the chamber where childhood went to die. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, heavy with the weight of secrets that were about to transform Pine Hollow from a quiet farming community into the epicenter of a trafficking investigation that would make national headlines and destroy the faith of everyone who had ever believed in human goodness. Sheriff Granger's hands were steady as he pulled the rusted iron ring upward, the metal groaning. Like a dying animal as the trapdoor surrendered its secrets to the October night. Dust exploded into the air, creating a cloud that seemed to carry the whispers of forgotten children and the stench of unspeakable acts committed in darkness. The opening revealed nothing but absolute blackness, a void so complete it seemed to swallow his flashlight beam before it could illuminate the horrors below. Kota didn't bark this time, instead lowering his head and releasing a sound that was part growl, part moan. A vocalization meant not to warn, but to mourn what they were about to discover. "What is this?" Margaret Dawson asked, her voice paper-thin and brittle as autumn leaves, all pretense of innocence finally stripped away by the sight of the secret entrance she'd thought would never be found. "That's what I aim to find out," Granger muttered, pulling out his heavy-duty flashlight and pointing it downward into the abyss that yawned beneath the barn floor like a mouth waiting to devour hope itself. Old wooden stairs descended into the blackness, each step worn smooth by countless trips carrying cargo that should never have existed. Cobwebs danced in the beam like lace dipped in sorrow, and the air that rose from below smelled of rust, mold, and something else. Something fundamentally wrong that made his war-hardened stomach clench with revulsion. "I'll need you to wait outside, Ma'am," Granger said, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had descended into hell before and lived to tell about it. Margaret didn't argue, didn't even move, just stood frozen like a statue of guilt carved from Tennessee marble. Granger nodded to Kota, and together they stepped into the darkness that had swallowed so many young lives over the decades. The stairs creaked under their combined weight, each step feeling like a page turning in a story that nobody wanted to read, but everyone needed to hear. At the bottom, Granger found a dirt floor and stone walls that had been carved from the earth like a tomb designed for the living. The space was small, about the size of a tool shed, but it contained furniture that would haunt his dreams for years to come. Empty wooden crates were stacked in one corner, each one the perfect size for transporting human cargo, and a single chair was bolted to the ground in the center of the room. Heavy chains hung from the wall beside it, their metal rusted and quiet now, but not long ago they had moved, had restrained, had held children who cried for mothers who would never come. Kota sniffed the floor methodically, then lifted his head and pointed his snout toward the far wall with the precision of a compass needle finding true north. Granger followed the beam of his flashlight to where his partner was indicating, and that's when he saw it smeared across the stone, like evidence that refused to be erased. Blood, old and brown, but unmistakably human, painted in patterns that spoke of violence and desperation. He stepped back slowly, not in fear but in fury that burned white-hot in his chest, the kind of rage that comes from seeing innocence destroyed by monsters who wear human faces. He took a long breath that tasted of earth and suffering, then whispered into the darkness, "We're not done here, not by a long shot." When they emerged from the underground chamber, Margaret Dawson had vanished like smoke dissipating in the wind, leaving behind only the echo of her footsteps and the knowledge that evil had been operating beneath Pine Hollow's trusting surface for longer than anyone dared imagine. When Sheriff Granger climbed out of that underground hell, the October night had turned colder, and Margaret Dawson had disappeared like a ghost, retreating to whatever dark realm had spawned her. He slammed the trapdoor shut with a sound like a coffin closing, pulled his truck around to the front of the property, and immediately called for backup with the kind of urgency that makes dispatchers sit up straight and reach for red phones. Deputy Eli Boone arrived 20 minutes later, chewing sunflower seeds and acting like this was just another routine call until he saw the expression on Granger's face. "You sure you're not overreacting, Sheriff?" Boone asked, kicking a stone toward the chicken coop where hens still pecked at scattered feed, as if nothing had changed in their small world. "That woman's been a saint in this town for 20 years. Built the school's new roof with her own money, feeds half the homeless, population every holiday." Granger pointed toward the barn with a finger that trembled slightly from suppressed rage. "There's a room under there, Eli, one with chains and bloodstains, and no mention of it in any official town records. We're talking about a torture chamber hidden beneath a children's orphanage." Boone's sunflower seeds stopped crunching as the words sank in like stones dropped into still water. "Sweet Jesus, are you saying what I think you're saying?" Granger looked him dead in the eye, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen too much human evil in one lifetime. "I'm saying we're bringing in state authorities tonight, and you don't breathe a word of this to anyone until they arrive. Not the mayor, not the reverend, not your cousin who works at the diner, nobody. This investigation just became federal." Boone nodded slowly, his face pale as moonlight. "Understood, Sheriff. What about the missing woman?" "Margaret Dawson is now a federal fugitive," Granger said, pulling out his radio to contact the state police. "I want roadblocks on every county border within 50 miles. If she so much as stops for gas, I want her name ringing alarm bells from Tennessee to Texas." Later that night, the wind shifted in Pine Hollow, carrying with it the kind of change that transforms small towns forever. Word hadn't gotten out officially, but communities this size have ways of sensing trouble that don't depend on official announcements or newspaper headlines. The woman at the general store noticed that Margaret Dawson hadn't picked up her weekly order of flour and lamp oil. The town librarian whispered to anyone who would listen about seeing Margaret packing books and personal items into boxes with the desperate efficiency of someone preparing to flee. Most telling of all, little Eliza May, the 10-year-old girl with hair like spilled ink who had been placed at Dawson Farm after her mother's overdose, didn't show up for school that morning. When Granger returned to the farm the next day with a federal search warrant that had been expedited through channels that moved faster than small-town justice ever could, he found a property that looked like a crime scene, abandoned in haste. The main house stood open to the October wind, its doors swinging on hinges that creaked like the voices of accusing ghosts. Inside, he discovered open drawers, furniture knocked over in the rush to escape, and a single muddy boot by the front door that spoke of someone who had run into the night without looking back. Margaret had fled, but in her haste she hadn't been able to take them all. Kota found the second hidden door behind the kitchen pantry, concealed by a false wall with hinges that had rusted from the inside, like the secret it protected. Granger braced his shoulder against the barrier and broke it down with the force of righteous fury, revealing a space that would add new chapters to the nightmare they were only beginning to understand. Inside the false wall behind the kitchen pantry, Sheriff Granger found 3 children huddled in a space no larger than a prison cell, their eyes wide with the kind of terror that comes from weeks of living in darkness. They were dirty, malnourished, and silent in a way that spoke of conditioning rather than natural shyness. The oldest couldn't have been more than 12, a girl with matted brown hair and a bruise on her temple that had faded to yellow-green, marking violence that was days old but still fresh in her memory. She looked up at Granger with eyes that had seen too much, a missing front tooth giving her the appearance of a child who had aged decades in the span of months. None of them cried when he opened that hidden door, and that silence was more heartbreaking than any scream could have been. They brought in paramedics, social workers, the local doctor, and even Pastor Williams, who looked like someone had stolen all the light from his soul when he saw what Pine Hollow's most celebrated citizen had been hiding behind her charitable facade. "These children," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I baptized 2 of them myself when Margaret first brought them to our congregation." Granger didn't answer because there were no words adequate for this level of betrayal, this systematic destruction of innocence that had operated under the cover of Christian charity for decades. While the rescued children were being treated and questioned by trained professionals, Kota had returned to the barn, where his nose led him to an even more disturbing discovery. Beneath the dirt floor of the underground chamber, his persistent digging revealed a second layer, a wooden hatch sealed with iron nails that had been hammered in with the kind of desperation that speaks of secrets too terrible to risk discovery. Granger and Deputy Boone pried it open with crowbars, their tools scraping against metal that screamed in protest as it surrendered another level of Margaret. Dawson's carefully constructed hell. What they found was a narrow passageway that ran beneath the entire property like a forgotten vein, connecting the barn to the main house and extending toward the old railroad tracks that carried freight trains through the darkness every Thursday night. Along that tunnel, hidden in alcoves carved from Tennessee stone, they discovered 7 more children, alive but barely, their bodies bearing evidence of medical procedures that no legitimate doctor would ever perform on unwilling subjects. The state authorities arrived within 2 hours of Granger's call, a convoy of black sedans and white vans that transformed Pine Hollow's quiet main street into the command center for what would become the largest child trafficking investigation in Tennessee history. FBI, Department of Homeland Security, specialized victim recovery teams, and federal prosecutors who understood that this case would require resources far beyond what any local sheriff's department could provide. Agent Maria Rivera from the Nashville field office walked through the tunnels with the grim efficiency of someone who had seen similar horrors before, but even her experienced demeanor cracked when she emerged from the underground network that had turned an orphanage into a distribution center for human trafficking. She knelt in front of Kota, scratching behind his ears with genuine gratitude, and asked the question that everyone was thinking. "He found all of them," Granger nodded, watching his partner accept the attention with the stoic dignity of a working dog who understood the importance of his calling. "He doesn't stop until he knows they're safe. Won't eat, won't rest, won't quit until every last one is accounted for." That night, while federal agents processed evidence and interviewed survivors, Granger remained at the station reading case files that painted a picture of corruption so vast it reached into state government offices and charitable organizations across the Southeast. Adoption papers for families that didn't exist, foster licenses approved by officials who had been bought, death certificates for children who had died from illness without any medical documentation, and transfer records to out-of-state facilities that had no record of ever receiving these young souls, who had simply vanished from all official records. At 2:03 a.m., the freight train whistle echoed across Pine Hollow's sleeping hills, its mournful cry cutting through the October night like a blade through silk. Kota's ears snapped to attention, his body going rigid with the kind of alertness that comes from recognizing a sound connected to unspeakable horror. That's when Granger remembered the second anonymous note, the desperate message scrawled in a child's handwriting. "They take us when the train whistles. Please listen to him. He knows." The pieces fell into place with the sickening clarity of a puzzle that reveals a picture no one wanted to see. The freight line that passed behind the Dawson property hadn't been used for legitimate cargo in years. Not officially, but Granger had grown up in these hills and knew every shortcut, every forgotten spur, every place where secrets went to die under cover of darkness. He grabbed his coat and rifle, motioning for Kota to follow as they slipped out of the station into the night that suddenly felt thick with malevolent purpose. They drove without headlights along back roads that twisted through Tennessee forests, parking behind the tree line where ancient oaks provided cover for what they were about to witness. Kota was already growling, his nose working overtime to process scents that told stories of human cargo and mechanical transport, of children loaded into containers like livestock bound for slaughter. Through the brush, they saw a covered wagon moving slowly toward the abandoned tracks, its progress deliberate and careful, driven by men who understood the importance of remaining invisible in a world that preferred not to see certain kinds of evil. 2 figures unloaded wooden crates from the barn, each container marked with stenciled letters that read, "Farm Equipment," in neat black paint. a disguise so simple it had fooled inspectors for decades. But when one crate shifted during transport, something inside screamed with the unmistakable voice of a terrified child, and Granger's blood turned to ice in his veins. He didn't wait for backup, didn't hesitate to calculate odds or consider tactical advantages. "Hands in the air, Sheriff's Department," he shouted, stepping from the shadows with his rifle trained on the two men who had just revealed themselves as participants in the most heinous crime Pine Hollow had ever witnessed. One man ran immediately, crashing through the underbrush like a wounded animal fleeing from hunters, but Kota was faster, leaping after him with the speed and precision of a guided missile. The dog's training kicked in with lethal efficiency, pinning the fleeing suspect to the ground with a snarl that spoke of justified violence applied to protect the innocent. The second man raised his hands too slowly, reaching for a weapon that he never had the chance to draw, as Deputy Boone arrived with sirens wailing and backup flooding the scene with the organized chaos of law enforcement, finally catching up to criminals who had operated in shadows for too long. "We got them," Granger said, his voice tight with emotion as he used his crowbar to open the first crate and reveal a drugged but breathing child, a little girl who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. They found 6 crates total that night, 3 containing children in various states of unconsciousness, the others empty but showing clear evidence of recent human occupancy. The shipping manifests they discovered in a metal box near the locomotive told a story that would fuel federal investigations for months. Dozens of names matched with ages, weights, physical descriptions, and prices that reduced human beings to commodities in a marketplace that existed in the darkest corners of civilized society. Margaret Dawson was still missing, but the noose was tightening with each piece of evidence that painted her not as a rogue operator, but as a key figure in a network that stretched across multiple states and connected to buyers whose identities would shake the foundations of institutions that ordinary people had been taught to trust. The next morning brought a final envelope, black this time with no name or return address, but containing a photograph that showed a woman's hand holding a boarding pass for Charleston and a Bible verse scribbled on the back, "And no one sees the tears of the righteous when they fall." They found Margaret Dawson 3 days later in Cedar Grove, Kansas, not hiding in some abandoned warehouse or using a fake identity in a seedy motel, but sitting peacefully on a church pew, wearing her signature pearls and sipping tea with the local women's ministry. She had joined their prayer circle just 48 hours earlier under the name Mrs. Evelyn Cross, claiming to be a widow from Charleston looking to serve God and bake pies for community fundraisers. That's how monsters move when cornered by justice. They don't vanish into thin air or disappear into criminal undergrounds. Instead, they simply switch masks, trading one charitable facade for another, counting on the fact that good people rarely suspect. Evil hiding behind familiar rituals of faith and service. Agent Rivera received the call at 5:14 a.m. when facial recognition software matched Margaret's image from a security camera outside the Kansas church. By 7 a.m., a federal convoy was rolling through Cedar Grove's quiet streets, and by 7:45, they had plucked Margaret Dawson off that wooden bench before the church choir finished their second hymn of morning worship. Sheriff Granger was waiting at the Pine Hollow airstrip when the federal transport plane touched down that evening, its engine still whining as they brought Pine Hollow's fallen angel back to face the consequences of 2 decades spent destroying young lives. Margaret didn't look scared when federal marshals led her down the aircraft steps in handcuffs and leg shackles, just tired, bone-deep tired, like someone who had spent a lifetime dodging judgment that had finally caught up with her. She walked with the resigned dignity of a woman who had always known this day would come, had probably rehearsed it in her mind during sleepless nights when the voices of her victims echoed through her dreams. The interrogation room at the Pine Hollow station was austere by design, one overhead light casting harsh shadows, a pitcher of water that nobody touched, and a digital recorder that would capture every word of a confession that would shock the nation. Agent Rivera sat across from Margaret with the patience of a hunter who had finally cornered dangerous prey, while Sheriff Granger stood in the corner with his arms crossed, studying the woman who had fooled his entire community for 20 years. "You have one chance to cooperate," Rivera said, her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement that had seen every variety of human evil. "One chance. No deals, no mercy, just the truth about what you've done to those children." Margaret took a careful sip of water and looked toward the two-way mirror where other agents watched and recorded every micro-expression that might reveal additional secrets. "I always thought I'd die before anyone figured it out," she said with disturbing calmness, as if discussing the weather rather than confessing to crimes that would earn her multiple life sentences. "Shows what I know about small-town sheriffs and their dogs." Rivera leaned forward, her eyes never leaving Margaret's face. "How long has this been operating?" Margaret's eyes softened with something that might have been nostalgia if it hadn't been so twisted by the context of child trafficking and abuse. 31 years, Agent Rivera. 31 years of finding homes for children who had nowhere else to go. The words hung in the air like poison gas, revealing a woman who had convinced herself that selling children to wealthy predators was somehow a form of charity, a twisted logic that allowed her to sleep at night while her victims cried in underground chambers. Granger felt his hands clench into fists as Margaret continued. "People like you never look where the ground is soft, where the foundations are cracked. You see a woman feeding the homeless and assume she must be good." As Margaret Dawson's confession unfolded over 3 days of federal interrogation, the true scope of her operation emerged like a cancer, spreading across a map of the American Southeast. What had begun as a local investigation in Pine Hollow, Tennessee, had uncovered a sophisticated trafficking network that stretched from rural orphanages to urban medical facilities, from charity organizations to private research laboratories, where children were subjected to experiments that violated every principle of human dignity. Federal agents working around the clock discovered financial records that painted a picture of systematic exploitation disguised as philanthropic work. Shell companies with names like New Hope Children's Services and Christian Family Foundation had been funneling money through offshore accounts for decades, creating a paper trail that led to buyers in 12 different countries who viewed American children as exotic commodities in a marketplace that existed beyond the reach of conventional law enforcement. The freight train that had carried its human cargo through Pine Hollow every Thursday night was just one link in a transportation network that utilized abandoned rail lines, private aircraft, and cargo ships to move children like livestock between distribution points that masqueraded as legitimate, charitable institutions. Dr. Walter Hargrave, whose empty house had yielded vials of experimental drugs and surgical instruments designed for procedures no ethical physician would ever perform, turned out to be one of 7 medical professionals involved in what federal prosecutors would later describe as systematic human experimentation conducted under the guise of treating orphaned and abandoned children. The children recovered from Dawson Farm and the Underground Railroad network told stories that would fuel nightmares for investigators who thought they had seen every variety of human cruelty. They spoke of being measured, weighed, and photographed like livestock at auction. They described wealthy visitors who examined them through one-way glass, discussing their physical attributes and future potential with the clinical detachment of buyers evaluating expensive merchandise. Most disturbing were the medical records found in Hargrave's hidden laboratory, documenting procedures performed on children as young as 6 years old, experiments designed to test pain tolerance, psychological conditioning, and physical resilience that transformed human beings into custom products manufactured to meet specific buyer requirements. One encrypted video file labeled Client MB London Special Request showed children being trained to respond to commands with the mechanical obedience of programmed machines, their natural childhood spontaneity systematically destroyed through techniques that would have impressed Nazi concentration camp doctors with their scientific thoroughness. The financial scale of the operation shocked even experienced federal investigators. Conservative estimates suggested that Margaret Dawson's network had generated over $40 million in revenue during its 3-decade operation, with individual children selling for prices ranging from $50,000 to $200,000, depending on age, physical characteristics, and the specific requirements of buyers who treated human trafficking like a luxury goods market. As additional arrests were made across 5 states, a clearer picture emerged of corruption that reached into state child protective services, local law enforcement agencies, and even federal oversight organizations that had been systematically compromised by bribes, blackmail, and the kind of willful blindness that allows evil to flourish when good people choose not to see what's happening in front of them. The investigation revealed that Pine Hollow's tragedy was not an isolated incident, but part of a national crisis that had been operating in plain sight for decades, protected by a combination of institutional indifference, bureaucratic incompetence, and the unfortunate truth that American society finds it easier to ignore the suffering of children who have no powerful advocates to speak for them. Margaret Dawson's trial began 6 months later in the federal courthouse in Memphis, ACER, proceeding that would be televised nationally and transform Pine Hollow from an unknown farming community into the epicenter of a conversation about institutional failure and the price of willful blindness. Sheriff Granger testified for 3 hours, his voice steady as he described finding that first underground chamber and the moment when Kota's instincts had cut through 20 years of carefully constructed lies. Deputy Boone testified about the freight train operation and the shipping, manifests that reduced human beings to inventory numbers. Agent Rivera presented evidence that painted a picture of systematic exploitation that had operated with surgical precision for over 3 decades. But the moment that silenced the packed courtroom was when Eliza May walked to the witness stand, dressed in a navy blue dress with her hair carefully brushed, carrying a small stuffed dog that had become her constant companion during the healing process. She didn't look at Margaret Dawson, didn't acknowledge the woman who had destroyed so many young lives. Instead, she looked straight at the judge with eyes that held wisdom no 10-year-old should possess. "My name is Eliza May," she said softly, her voice carrying across the hushed courtroom like a prayer spoken in the darkness. "I remember everything." Her testimony lasted 47 minutes and contained details that would haunt the jury for the rest of their lives. She spoke of nights underground where children were examined by visitors wearing surgical gloves, of Margaret's voice above the trapdoor telling them that good children stay quiet and do what they're told, and of the train whistle that meant some of her friends would disappear forever into a darkness that swallowed hope itself. The jury deliberated for 6 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all 28 federal counts, including conspiracy to commit human trafficking, child endangerment, and operating a criminal enterprise. Sentencing was deferred to allow additional charges from other states, but legal experts predicted that Margaret Dawson would spend the remainder of her life in federal prison, assuming she survived long enough to face justice for crimes that had destroyed over 100 young lives. As federal marshals led Margaret away in handcuffs, she turned to Sheriff Granger one final time, her voice carrying a note of genuine curiosity rather than remorse. "You were always too curious for your own good, Thomas. Most people prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths." Granger didn't respond, but Kota did, releasing a single sharp bark that seemed to carry the voices of every child who had cried in the darkness, and finally found someone willing to listen. The cleanup in Pine Hollow continued for months after the trial ended. The barn was demolished and replaced with a community garden where children could play in sunlight instead of hiding in shadows. The tunnels were filled with concrete, but bronze. Plaques were placed throughout the town to ensure that the memory of what had happened would never be forgotten or repeated. Kota received the Congressional Medal of Honor for canine service, the first time in American history that a dog had been recognized at the federal level for exposing human trafficking. But perhaps more importantly, Pine Hollow learned to listen differently, to ask harder questions, and to remember that evil often wears the face of charity when it wants to operate without interference. The town's children now learn about recognizing danger, speaking up when something feels wrong, and trusting their instincts even when adults tell them everything is fine. And sometimes, late at night when the wind carries strange sounds across the Tennessee hills, people remember that heroes don't always wear badges or carry guns. Sometimes they have 4 legs, wet noses, and the courage to keep digging until they find the truth that others would prefer to keep buried forever. And have you ever witnessed any heroic animal act? Tell us your story in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next videos.